So encryption being our main topic, it's one that's a lot more on everybody's minds these days, a lot more at the forefront. As I walked in this building, I saw the Alan Turing Executive Conference Room, and that was one of the things that I had here on the slide, a movie that came out a couple of years ago that kind of told the story of Enigma and some of the code breakers in World War II. Kind of helped bring some of those stories to light, and was one of the things that's gotten encryption a little bit in the forefront of folks' minds. Certainly the stuff that played out between Apple and the FBI with the San Bernardino shootings, encryption, being in the industry that we're in, we're used to talking about encryption all the time, but we're not used to it being a front page headline every day, which it was during that period. So brought to light a lot of the issues that are controversial around encryption as far as things like backdoors and things like law enforcement's access to encryption and privacy, and a lot of those issues have bubbled up quite a bit more and gotten into the public eye. Ransomware, the little figure on the right side there, has become one of the really hot threats right now. The interesting development of ransomware basically being somebody coming and trying to encrypt all your data and hold it hostage for you unless you pay a ransom. The interesting development there has been the rapid rise in that, but not only that, but of people paying it to make the problem go away very quickly. And the science behind this, both the social and the technical science of it, being enough to make profit on it, but yet not so much that it keeps people from wanting to pay it right away. So there's both social and technical aspects of that. We'll dive into that a little bit. But then, of course, ongoing in the news the last 2-3 years has been a lot of the story around data breaches, targeted data breaches, where people are going after certain types of data at certain types of companies. One of the recent big ones, Yahoo, probably one of the biggest in history. This apparently had happened several months back, but we're talking about 500 million records compromised, right? And a lot of those records, the name and password were encrypted, but a lot of the personal information that went along with it was not. And there's a lot more heightened awareness today about the need to protect the personal information that goes along with some of the more traditionally encrypted information. So that made some news. I couldn't resist, based on the political climate of the moment. There was a breach pretty recently in the Trump hotel chains that coughed up about 70,000 credit card records. So it feels like in this election, we've got one candidate that won't release any emails and one candidate that's perfectly happy to release all your credit card information. We got it all going. And this is kind of a nifty visualization of some of the data breaches in the space, but just kind of illustrating the breadth and depth of what's been going on. The circle sizes are around the number of records that were compromised in certain breaches. So MySpace is a funny one in the middle. I didn't think anybody used or MySpace was even around anymore, but there were still a lot of email records around, and that one was to the tune of 164 million. That's about an order of 3 less than Yahoo. Yahoo's going to come on here and be the biggest bubble of all. But you see companies of all types, everything from the retailers like Home Depot, adult websites, talk about privacy concerns, right, and need to protect personal information. Clinton campaign, voter databases, you see companies of all types. A lot of more rise in healthcare companies too, again, because people are going after personal information. You think of credit card numbers as a traditional hack target, but now healthcare information is being used to do things like file false claims, get access to drugs that you might want to then resell or use for yourself. The value of healthcare information on the black market has risen to the point where it's at or beyond the value of a credit card number. So seeing a lot of dynamics based on the issues around personal information. So what role does encryption play? Encryption, and this is a pretty basic slide, but it builds for a purpose. And you've got kind of 3 elements you got to worry about. You've got to worry about the data that you're trying to protect. You have to worry about choosing an encryption algorithm to go ahead and encrypt to protect that data. And at the end of the day, you have to have some trust in that process. But the really important part in all of it is the keys. It's pretty easy today with the information that's available to choose a good encryption algorithm. There's a lot of information available about what are the approved algorithms, which ones have undergone scrutiny, which have certifications, etc. What we find, people aren't going out there trying to break the use of approved algorithms. That's a kind of a not worthwhile venture, not something you're going to generally be able to do. what people are going to do is go after encryption keys that are poorly protected. So somebody that's gone to the trouble of doing encryption, but hasn't taken the proper steps to secure the key. Because all you got to do is find the key, and none of this matters. You can get access to the data very easily. So what we're seeing now is the big difference between those that are able to protect their keys properly, being the ones that are safer, the ones that are not taking the adequate steps, some of the best practice steps to protect keys, the ones that are getting in trouble. It's not just enough, in the eyes of any auditor or any security evaluator to just say I'm doing encryption. They're all going a level deeper and saying, well, where's that key? Where's that key kept? How are you protecting that key throughout its life cycle? A little bit about the algorithms. I mentioned, it's pretty common and standard knowledge about what are the approved algorithms of today. But to just go through a couple of them, on the asymmetric algorithm or public key side, most people are familiar with the RSA algorithm. That's what's used for SSL site certificates most commonly, based on a public and a private key that have a mathematical relationship that are sourced in really big prime numbers that come from good random number sources. RSA's been in use for a long time, and over the last 10, 15 years or so, we've seen a progression of the use of it being approved at certain key lengths, shorter key lengths, and now moving to longer key lengths. So for example, RSA with 1024-bit keys was the standard that was used through 80s, 90s, etc. Now that key length is based on the computational powers of today, has been deprecated. You're now seeing RSA 2048 and even beyond used as standard going forward. An algorithm that's become very popular these days is elliptic curve crypto, because it has the same security properties from a public key perspective, but way shorter key lengths. So in particular, for devices like mobile devices, when you're doing crypto out on devices with less computational power, and you think of the Internet of Things and all the different devices that are now getting internet connections and might need to have secure communications, elliptic curve crypto is a much better fit because it doesn't require the horsepower of an RSA, and the key lengths are a lot shorter for equivalent security. So that table over there kind of shows you a comparison between RSA key lengths on the left and ECC elliptic curve crypto key lengths on the right. So we've seen ECC start to get quite a bit more powerful and popular because of those properties. As far as just pure encrypting data, public-private key setup isn't well optimized for that. If you're encrypting a lot of data, a symmetric key where you share the same private key on each side remains the most popular and always will be the most popular. We've seen the progression from the 70s, 80s, 2000 beyond, from single data encryption standard DES to triple DES, and now to AES as the well-accepted standard. And AES has a number of different key lengths that you can use. As you can see down there, the strength of an encryption using AES increases dramatically as you crank up the key size up into the 128, 192, 256 range. And what we see people using in practice today is exactly in that range, that 128 to 256 bit AES as the gold standard and strong crypto. And then finally, hashing. Hashing algorithms are an important piece of the puzzle too. So if you're familiar with digital signatures and some of the applications of those, hashing algorithms are what can take a big chunk of data and boil it down to a fixed size. So if you want to have integrity of a message from one side to another, take the big long message, take a hash of it, sign it, send it to the other end, and the person on the other end can verify the signature, perform the same hash function, and make sure that that message hasn't been muddled with in the middle. Hashing algorithms, there's been a lot more changes in the world than up here. We've been through standards like MD4 and 5, SHA-1, which have all had been exposed to have mathematical weaknesses over time. One of the things a hashing algorithm has to do is you have to have a guarantee that any unique message will boil down to a unique hash value. There can't be a collision. No two messages can create the same hashed value. And many of the older hashing algorithms had problems with that. So we're currently in the world on a standard of the SHA-2 algorithm, which is in good shape. It hasn't been shown to have any weaknesses, and it's widely used today. There's actually been another version of it approved, and it's sort of on standby, if you will, for if any mathematical weaknesses are found in SHA-2. For example, SHA-3 is there for use. However, SHA-3 takes longer to perform, has some downsides to it, and it hasn't been around, not some downsides, but hasn't been around as long, hasn't been proven SHA-2, so there aren't many people using that today. SHA-2 is really kind of the standard. And we've seen a lot of action in this area because a lot of people used SHA-1 for their public key infrastructures and issuing digital certificates for authentication and code signing, things like that, and have applications that work with SHA-1. And there's been a difficult transition, over the last few years for applications that support SHA-1 into applications that support SHA-2. So this isn't something that you do lightly because it can potentially affect a lot of different applications. But that's sort of the state on the algorithms that are most commonly used out there. The other place people are starting to look a lot closer is at random numbers. So the source of any good encryption starts with a quality key, and a quality key starts with a quality random number. And one of the underappreciated aspects of crypto is it's actually kind of hard to get your hands on something that's truly random in the world of computing, right? You can take kind of a quick random sample off of a clock somewhere, but that's not really random. That's sort of an instantaneous thing in time, but that's off a deterministic source like a clock. Unless you're in a situation where you've got electronic circuits that actually have electrostatic noise or something like that, it's actually very hard to get at a true source of randomness. So in most computing environments, they have some sort of a source that they then will test to see if it's random enough to be used as a key. So one of the interesting developments that's going on now, because of this heightened awareness of the need for good random numbers, and the fact that people are using encryption and crypto a heck of a lot more, is sources of good entropy for random numbers. And we're starting to see some interesting work going on based on quantum mechanics as that being a source, photons and LEDs, and I'm not going to pretend to understand any of the kind of the science behind it, but quantum methods are starting to show up as random number generators, and we might, in the next 5 to 10 years, start to see products based on that that will help to supply keys on a large basis. So if you think about big data or any environment where you've got a lot of data, you've got to protect a lot of keys to generate, this method might come into the fold. Well, let's get back to today. So why are people using encryption? Well, in our industry, where Pat and I have worked for a lot of years, a lot of the driver has always been compliance with standards. So in the payment card industry, for example, they have a lot of stringent compliance requirements, PCI, et cetera, that talk about protection of certain payment data and associated data. And that's always been a big driver for the people that we work with in order to do this. However, we've started to see a major shift over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's been companies looking at a lot of the targeted threats that are going on and saying, if I'm a company like that, or I've got something really important, my secret sauce or my intellectual property or the design of my products that I really need to protect an extra level, that's where we're starting to see a lot more use of encryption. So a targeted decision of this data is really important to my company. If it got out, it would threaten me big time from a financial perspective or a competitive perspective, what have you. So that's why on this chart you see protecting intellectual property, protecting against specific threats, starting to bubble up on that list, because now there's a focus to why you might protect yourself based on what you see in the market. The other thing is there is much heightened awareness of the need to protect personal information. So whether it's students at a university, whether it's employees in your HR system, so much more heightened scrutiny and just responsibility on the fact of companies that collect that data as not wanting to be the one who coughs it up to an attacker. So protecting personal information, that's why that has really risen up on the list. So what are some of the challenges? You might start to think, well, why aren't people going more whole hog and starting to encrypt almost everything, or even everything, right? Well, it's actually not as easy as it sounds. One of the problems that a lot of folks are facing today is that data is going to a lot more places. So you might identify a specific type of data that you want to protect, but in today's world, that data might be going out into the cloud, might be going out to mobile phones, devices, and with virtualization. There's a lot of departments that have a lot of trouble just figuring out where are all of the different places any particular data type is going. And that's a reality of today, because a lot of what's been done has been moving data around to make business easier to do, or to enable mobile workers, right? We're seeing people not having the trouble with figuring out what's the important data to protect. It's the where the heck is all that data going on a day-to-day basis. And that discovery issue. Some of the traditional things that we see, training users, determining which algorithms to use, everything, That's the easy stuff, right? People aren't troubled by that very much anymore. It's really that where the heck is all the data going? A little bit on what data to encrypt, although not nearly, it's only a little less than half of the problem of actually figuring out where it's going. The interesting thing there too is if you do identify a particular piece of data that you're worried about, it does you no good to go and encrypt it and protect the key really well in one place if that data lives 3 or 4 other places, because very well documented is the fact that today's attacks, they'll find their way into one system. If they don't find an easy target there, they'll just move laterally within, right? So don't fool yourself into thinking you've protected it by protecting it in one place if you've got it several other places, because chances are those attacks will just worm their way to where the data is either unprotected or maybe where the key protection is a little sloppier and they can get at the key. And that kind of gets at the aspects of key management. So once, I think I mentioned, once folks have started to do encryption in more places, you start to realize that keeping track of the keys is actually a lot harder and more complicated than you might think. One of the obvious consequences if you lose a key is that you really have to consider any data that's encrypted with that key compromised or lost at that point because the key's in the wild, right? Pretty straightforward. The flip side of that, and that a lot of people have run into now, is if you encrypt data with a key and then you lose that key, you're not going to get the data back, right? You've got a serious availability, loss of service, downtime type of a problem. Unless you've scuttled that data off somewhere else where it's unprotected, in which case you've completely defeated your encryption process in the first place, right? So this becomes particularly hard in cases where people are doing the right thing and rotating their keys. One of the best practices is to change your keys every X weeks or X months, right, for security protection. When you do that rotation to the next key, maybe your backup is kept in a previous key. If you get rid of that previous key when you take it offline, now you don't have access to your backup. So keeping track of keys gets complicated, especially in a rotation scenario, and especially in a multi-product environment where you might be encrypting in your database, you might be doing some disk encryption for some laptops, you might be doing some application level encryption for certain critical apps. It gets complicated fast, and it's tripping a lot of people up right now. And this is that same point, lifecycle management. Keys actually have a pretty long life, and you'll see in these little fancy yellow books that Pat handed out, the life cycle from a generation to a destruction of a key. There's a lot of states you have to worry about. One of the things we always look at is what are people doing for key management? And the fact that over 50% of them are primarily relying on manual processes for their key management just tells you, A, things are going to be mistake prone. B, I'm sure they're painful because keeping track of all this stuff in spreadsheets and paper is very painful. And it's only going to get worse because of that. Now we are seeing some more influence of some formal key management policies, people centralizing key management, about a third of folks saying, hey, I think I can get better control of this with a central group feeding multiple applications that are doing stuff having to do with keys. So you start to see some evidence of formality, but those numbers in the 30th percentile pale in comparison to the folks that are still using manual process. We are starting to see folks starting to use some more automated methods. Hardware security modules are a specific type of device that is built to protect any crypto process like encryption or digital signatures and the keys associated with it. Starting to see people use those a little bit more because they can automate a lot of these actions and make sure that you follow the correct steps in properly protecting your key and managing it through its life cycle. Now the cloud has been a real interesting development over the last 5 to 7 years. In the early going, and I don't know if a lot of you heard the same things, but early on we heard a lot of trepidation from, in particular, our enterprise customers about using the cloud. They saw the great benefits and they said, look, we'll figure out some workloads that aren't as sensitive, aren't something that we're worried about getting exposed to the broader world. We'll use the cloud for those because we see the benefits, we see that it scales up fast, we see that we don't want to be buying server after server after server. We can turn that CapEx budget to an OpEx budget, rent space in the cloud, that's all good. What's happened over the last several years is those cloud providers, especially the major ones, have done a darn good job at security. And in fact, the attitude of today is a lot of enterprises and organizations feel like the cloud providers actually have a much stronger practice and have been audited to certain levels in their security that far exceeds what they're able to do with their limited staff and their limited people. So a really big flip-flop in terms of people's attitude toward the cloud. We're starting to see folks much more willing to put sensitive data in the cloud because of it. Starting to kind of move back from the fear. Also a big driver today, for those that still don't want to take that leap and use the public cloud, is people wanting to take advantage of that cloud technology. So things like RESTful APIs. The way that cloud's technology is being used, they want to use that same technology in the data center, in a private cloud type of scenario, if you will. Even if they're not going the step of using the public cloud as much, they don't want to have two different sets of tools. One for the data center and one for the cloud. They want to be using the same technology, which is a great play, right? Because now you are more agile and able to shift workloads back and forth as your business needs desire, as your performance needs change, or if your security stance changes. Also, another development in the last couple of years around encryption has been, well, why are you thinking of doing encryption in the first place, right? It's not just, oh, I need to encrypt it because it's important. For the people that are worried about their data being subpoenaed from a cloud provider, for example, people in that type of place want to do encryption, but they want to be in control of the key themselves. They don't want somebody to be able to go to the cloud provider and subpoena that cloud provider for their data. They don't want to be the person that's in the middle of that. On the other hand, cloud providers will often, when they have shared hardware and multi-tenancy and all that, they will, if my company's data is up there, they'll encrypt it in a key so that when that volume gets reallocated, that piece of hardware gets reallocated to somebody else, my data isn't left behind, right? If they encrypt that data and they throw away the key when the volume gets reallocated, that's just as good as deleting the data because it's not available. So a cloud provider will often use encryption and key management in that scenario. And in that case, me as a subscriber, I don't care to manage that key, right? That's the cloud provider's business to figure out when volumes are being reallocated and data needs to be moved and it needs to be sanitized. So that's a case where I don't care about controlling the key. I'm happy to let the cloud provider. And there are gradations in between, with the point being that control of the encryption key is a really big issue in encryption, especially when you're going into a cloud scenario. And that's one of the big changes we've seen in the last few years. A lot of the people that have been hands-off and worried about going to the cloud because of the need to properly protect their sensitive data are saying, okay, cloud providers, give me a way for me to still use your cloud, but control the key myself. That's going to help me make that leap. I hope today gave you some interesting bits of information, and I want to thank our hosts again for having us in here today, and thank you all for coming in.